18-year-old Violet Ashford wore silk while her four sisters wore envy. Their father showered her with jewels and portraits, while they received ledgers and chores. But jealousy, festering in the shadows of a grand estate, has a way of turning deadly. Before we dive into the story, what's the darkest case you've ever heard or experienced? Write it in the comments. Let's compare notes. Also, tell us where you're watching from today and what time is it right now. We're building a community of truth seekers who aren't afraid of the dark. Now, let's continue with the story. The spring of 1891 arrived at the Ashford estate with an explosion of cherry blossoms and bitter resentment. Violet stood before the gilt-edged mirror in her bedroom, watching as the seamstress pinned the final adjustments to her cream silk gown. The fabric whispered against her skin like a secret, expensive and delicate, in ways her sister's dresses never were. "Beautiful, Miss Violet," the seamstress murmured, her weathered hand smoothing the intricate lace at the shoulders. "Your father will be so pleased." Violet smiled, but something in her reflection troubled her. Perhaps it was the way her green eyes seemed too bright, too aware of things a young woman of 18 shouldn't need to worry about. Or perhaps it was the shadow that passed by her doorway at that precise moment. Margaret, the eldest at 28, pausing just long enough to observe before moving on with measured, deliberate steps. The Ashford estate sprawled across the Devonshire countryside like a sleeping giant, all gray stone and climbing ivy, its windows watching the world with ancient indifference. Inside, the house breathed with old money and older traditions. Their father, Augustus Ashford, had built his fortune in steel and railways, transforming the family from comfortable gentry into something approaching aristocracy. But wealth, Violet had learned, didn't soften everything. Sometimes it sharpened the edges until they cut. She descended the grand staircase that evening for dinner, her new dress catching the light from the chandelier overhead. The dining room stretched before her, absurdly large for 6 people, the mahogany table gleaming with silver and crystal. Her sisters were already seated. Margaret occupied the chair closest to their father's right hand, her posture perfect, her brown hair pulled back so severely it seemed to pain her. At 28, she managed the household accounts with an iron fist and a ledger that never balanced in anyone's favor but her own. Caroline sat beside her, 26 and brittle as winter ice, her thin fingers drumming an agitated rhythm against the tablecloth. Then Beatrice, 24, with calculating gray eyes that measured everything and everyone, finding most wanting. And finally, Josephine, the youngest of Violet's elders at 22, quiet and watchful in ways that made Violet's skin prickle. "Violet, darling," Augustus Ashford rose from his chair, his face transforming with genuine delight. "Come, let me see you properly." She crossed to him, feeling 4 pairs of eyes tracking her movement like wolves watching prey. Her father took her hands, holding her at arm's length to admire the dress. "Exquisite," he proclaimed. "You'll be the jewel of the season, my dear. Every young man in the county will fall at your feet." "Thank you, Father." Violet kissed his cheek, catching the scent of pipe tobacco and cologne that had meant safety since childhood. "Do sit, Violet," Margaret said, her voice honey over stone. "The soup is getting cold." The meal proceeded with the careful choreography of a dance everyone knew, but no one enjoyed. Augustus dominated the conversation, as always, speaking of his business ventures, the new railway line, the expansion of his foundries. His daughters listened with varying degrees of attention. Margaret interjected with household matters. Caroline pushed food around her plate, Beatrice smiled at all the right moments. Josephine stared at her wine glass as if it contained prophecies. And then Augustus set down his fork with a decisive clink. "I have an announcement," he declared, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "I've decided to host a debut ball for Violet. 3 weeks from Saturday. The finest families in the county will attend. No expense will be spared." The silence that followed stretched like taffy, thin and dangerous. Violet felt her stomach knot. She'd known this was coming, had heard her father planning it with the housekeeper, but hearing it announced at dinner, seeing her sisters' faces. "How wonderful," Margaret said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Though, Father, surely you remember that when I turned 18, you said such extravagances were unnecessary." "Times were different then, Margaret. I was still establishing the business. And when I came of age," Caroline added, her voice sharp, "you said balls were frivolous displays better suited to families with old money and empty heads." Augustus waved his hand dismissively. "I may have been too conservative in my thinking. Violet deserves to be celebrated properly. She's special." The word hung in the air like smoke. Special. Violet wanted to sink through her chair, through the floor, through the earth itself. She'd never asked to be special, never requested the attention that came with being the youngest, the prettiest, the one who reminded their father most of their mother. "Special indeed," Beatrice murmured, taking a delicate sip of wine. "Tell us, Father, will you be commissioning another portrait? It seems Violet only has 3 in the gallery. One might almost forget she's your daughter, without sufficient visual reminders." The sarcasm was subtle enough that Augustus missed it entirely, but Violet heard it clearly. So did her other sisters. Caroline's lips twitched with something that might have been amusement. Josephine's quiet gaze finally lifted from her wine glass, settling on Violet with an expression she couldn't read. "Actually," Augustus continued, oblivious or uncaring, "I've been meaning to discuss something else. I've made some changes to my will. Legal matters, you understand, but I thought you should know. Violet will inherit the London house and the bulk of the railway shares. Margaret, you'll have the estate manager's cottage and a modest income. Caroline, the Brighton property. Beatrice, the investments in textiles. Josephine, the library and mother's jewelry collection." The words fell like stones into still water, ripples spreading outward in waves of shock. Violet's hands trembled in her lap. This couldn't be happening. This was worse than the portraits, worse than the dresses, worse than any favoritism that had come before. "Father," she began, but Margaret spoke over her. "The London house is worth more than all our inheritances combined." Her voice remained controlled, but something flickered behind her eyes, something dark and decisive. "Violet is the youngest," Augustus said simply. "She'll need the most support. Besides, she reminds me so very much of your mother. The same grace, the same beauty. When I look at her, I see Elizabeth alive again." And there it was, the truth they all knew but never spoke. Their mother had died giving birth to Violet, and in some twisted mathematics of grief and memory, their father had decided this made Violet both irreplaceable and deserving of everything. The other daughters were pale copies, earlier drafts, practice runs before the masterpiece. Caroline stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I have a headache. Excuse me." She left without waiting for dismissal. Beatrice followed moments later, murmuring something about correspondence that needed attention. Josephine lingered only long enough to place her napkin beside her plate with careful precision before drifting away like smoke. Only Margaret remained, her posture still perfect, her face a mask of composure. "Congratulations on the ball, Violet," she said. "I'm sure it will be memorable." After dinner, Violet retreated to her bedroom, but sleep wouldn't come. She stood at her window, looking out over the moonlit gardens, and tried to understand how love could feel so much like a curse. She hadn't asked for her father's favor, hadn't manipulated or schemed for it, but she received it anyway, and in receiving it, had made enemies of the only family she had left. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside her door. Violet turned, expecting to see her lady's maid, but the footsteps passed by without stopping. Then more footsteps, lighter, quicker. Then a third set, deliberate and measured. Her sisters, moving through the house like pieces on a chessboard, converging somewhere out of sight. Curiosity overcame caution. Violet eased her door open and slipped into the corridor. Following the sound of whispered voices to Margaret's study, the door stood, slightly ajar, and through the gap, Violet could see all four of her sisters gathered in the lamplight. "This cannot continue," Margaret was saying. "He's left us nothing but scraps, while she gets everything." "She's just a child," Josephine said softly. "She didn't choose this." "She accepts it readily enough," Caroline spat. "Did you see her at dinner? Preening like a peacock while father praised her gown." "The question," Beatrice interrupted, her voice calm and analytical, "is what we intend to do about it. Complaining changes nothing. Action is required." Margaret crossed to her desk and withdrew something from the drawer, a leather-bound journal. She opened it, and even from her hiding place, Violet could see pages filled with dense handwriting. "I've been thinking about this for some time," Margaret said. "Father has made his choice. Perhaps it's time we made ours." The words seemed to suck the air from the hallway. Violet pressed her hand against the wall to steady herself. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Caroline asked, but her tone suggested she already knew. Margaret smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "I'm suggesting that accidents happen, especially to young women who don't watch their step carefully enough." Violet didn't wait to hear more. She fled back to her bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs. She locked the door with shaking hands and stood in the darkness, trying to convince herself she'd misunderstood, that her sisters couldn't possibly mean what she thought they meant. But deep down, in the place where truth lives regardless of how much we wish it didn't, Violet knew exactly what she'd heard. And she knew, with terrible certainty, that the debut ball 3 weeks away would be more than just a celebration. It would be a beginning, or perhaps an end. The 3 weeks before the ball passed like a fever dream. Violet tried to warn her father about what she'd overheard, but the moment she mentioned her sister's late-night meeting, Augustus had waved her concerns away with irritation. "You're being dramatic, Violet. Your sisters are excited for you, that's all. Perhaps a bit envious, but that's natural." He'd returned to his newspaper. The conversation closed. Natural. The word haunted her. Was it natural for Caroline to accidentally spill tea on Violet's new gloves? Was it natural for Beatrice to suggest a hairstyle that made Violet look sickly? Was it natural for Margaret to reassign Violet's lady's maid to other duties, leaving her to dress herself? The night of the ball arrived with unseasonable warmth. The estate blazed with gaslight and candles, transforming the old stone house into something magical. Carriages lined the drive, depositing elegantly dressed guests who exclaimed over the decorations, the orchestra, the champagne flowing like water. Violet stood in her bedroom, staring at her reflection. The gown was perfection, pale blue silk that caught the light with each movement. But something was wrong. The dress hung differently than it had during the final fitting. She turned, examining the back, and her breath caught. The seam along the spine had been cut, not torn, but deliberately sliced with scissors, or a blade. One wrong movement, and the entire back would split open, exposing her undergarments to 200 guests. "Caroline?" Violet whispered. Her sister had insisted on helping her dress earlier, had been alone with the gown for nearly 10 minutes. There was no time to change. Guests were already arriving. Violet grabbed her shawl, draping it carefully over her shoulders to hide the damage, and made her way downstairs with her heart hammering. The ballroom was magnificent. Roses everywhere, their scent almost overwhelming. The orchestra played a waltz, and couples spun across the polished floor like figures in a music box. Augustus stood at the entrance, greeting guests with the pride of a man displaying his finest achievement. "There she is," he announced as Violet appeared. "My beautiful daughter." The room turned to look. Violet felt the weight of their gazes, the assessment, the judgment. She smiled and descended the final steps, keeping the shawl tight around her shoulders. Margaret approached first, elegant in dark green. "Sister, you look lovely, though perhaps a bit warm with that shawl." "I'm quite comfortable. Thank you. Here, let me help you." Margaret reached for the shawl, but Violet stepped back. "I prefer to keep it on." Something flickered in Margaret's eyes. Disappointment, perhaps, or calculation. The evening proceeded in a blur of introductions and dances. Young men approached, requested her hand, led her through waltzes and quadrilles. Violet moved carefully, conscious of the damaged seam, the potential disaster waiting to unfold. Between dances, she noticed her sisters watching from various corners of the room. Caroline whispered to a group of young women, and they turned to stare at Violet with expressions of poorly concealed disdain. Beatrice stood with several eligible bachelors, speaking in low tones that made them glance at Violet with newly critical eyes. Then Josephine appeared at her elbow, soft-voiced and concerned. "You must be parched. Here, I brought you champagne." Violet accepted the glass gratefully. The bubbles tickled her nose as she raised it to her lips. "Wait." A hand caught her wrist. She turned to find a young man she'd danced with earlier, Lord Pemberton's son. "Forgive me, Miss Ashford, but I couldn't help noticing. There's something in your glass." He was right. In the gaslight, she could see tiny particles suspended in the liquid, settling slowly toward the bottom. "Probably just sediment," Josephine said quickly. "Champagne sometimes has residue from the bottle." "Champagne should be clear," the young man insisted. "Miss Ashford, I would not drink that if I were you." Violet set the glass down on a nearby table, her hands trembling. Josephine's face remained pleasant, concerned, but her eyes told a different story. She turned and melted into the crowd before Violet could speak. The room tilted, not from poison, but from understanding. They weren't going to stop. This was just the beginning. "Are you quite well?" Lord Pemberton's son asked. "You've gone very pale. I need some air." Violet fled to the terrace, gulping down the night breeze like a drowning woman breaking the surface. Behind her, music and laughter continued. Her father's voice rose above the rest, telling some story that made his audience roar with amusement. She looked down at her hands, still shaking. The glass had been meant for her. Something had been added to it, something that would have made her ill in front of everyone. A humiliation to mar the perfect evening her father had created. The terrace door opened. Violet spun, expecting one of her sisters, but it was only a servant. "Miss Ashford, your father is asking for you. He wants to make a toast." She returned to the ballroom, moving through the crowd like a ghost. Augustus stood on the small stage where the orchestra played, beaming with paternal pride. He raised his glass, and the room fell silent. "To my daughter Violet," he declared. "The light of my life and the future of the Ashford name." Everyone drank. Violet caught sight of her sisters, standing together near the back wall. Margaret's expression was unreadable. Caroline looked away. Beatrice smiled, but it was the smile of someone watching a play, waiting for the final act. And Josephine stared directly at Violet, her quiet eyes holding a message as clear as spoken words. This was just a warning. Next time, we finish what we started. The days out of the ball stretched into weeks of suffocating dread. Violet stopped eating anything she hadn't watched being prepared. She locked her bedroom door at night and pushed a chair beneath the handle. Sleep came in fragments, broken by footsteps in the hallway and shadows beneath her door. Her father noticed nothing. He was too busy celebrating what he considered a triumphant evening, recounting compliments from guests, discussing potential suitors. The tainted champagne, the sabotaged dress, all of it invisible to him, because he refused to see. Violet tried once more to make him understand. "Father, please. My sisters are dangerous. The champagne at the ball was contaminated. Lord Pemberton's son saw it himself." Augustus looked up from his breakfast with barely concealed annoyance. "Violet, this persecution complex is becoming tiresome. Young Pemberton is known for his overactive imagination. Besides, your sisters have been nothing but accommodating since the ball." He was right about that last part, and it terrified her. Margaret had become solicitous, offering to review the household menus with Violet, teaching her the management of servants. Caroline suggested afternoon walks, just the two of them, always toward the isolated woods at the edge of the property. Beatrice brought books to Violet's room, insisting she read them before bed, volumes with peculiar musty smells that made Violet's head ache, and Josephine simply watched, her presence constant and unnerving, appearing in doorways and corridors like a ghost. "They're planning something," Violet whispered. "Enough!" Augustus slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "Your mother would be ashamed of these accusations. Your sisters love you. They're your family." Family. The word felt like a noose tightening. That evening, Margaret called a family meeting in the drawing room. All 5 sisters gathered, the first time they'd been alone together since the ball. Violet positioned herself near the door, her body tense, ready to flee. "I've been thinking," Margaret began, settling into the high-backed chair like a queen on a throne. "About Mother." The mention of their mother shifted something in the room. Even Caroline's perpetual bitterness softened slightly. "It's been 18 years since we lost her," Margaret continued. 18 years since Violet's birth took her from us." The words hung in the air, accusatory, despite their gentle delivery. "I never asked to be born," Violet said quietly. "No, of course not." Beatrice smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "None of us choose our circumstances, but we can choose how we honor Mother's memory. Which is why," Margaret said, "I propose a family trip to Mother's childhood cottage in Cornwall, a chance for us to reconnect, to remember her together, away from Father's constant interference." Violet's blood turned to ice. "The cottage? That's 3 hours away, in the middle of nowhere." "Exactly," Caroline said, speaking for the first time. "Peace, quiet, just the 5 of us. I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" Josephine asked softly. "Are you afraid of us, Violet?" The question was a trap, and they all knew it. If Violet said yes, she confirmed herself as paranoid and ungrateful. If she said no, she'd have no reason to refuse. "I simply don't see the purpose." "The purpose," Margaret said, her voice hardening, "is family unity. Father agrees it's an excellent idea. In fact, He's already approved our departure for this Friday. 3 days at the cottage, returning Monday morning. Violet felt the walls closing in. Father approved this? He thinks it's wonderful that we want to spend time together, Beatrice added. He was quite touched, actually. Said something about his daughters finally acting like sisters should. It was masterful. They'd manipulated Augustus perfectly, turning his desire for family harmony into a weapon. If Violet refused now, she'd break his heart, confirm all his suspicions about her mental state. He might even force her to go. I need to think about it, Violet managed. There's nothing to think about, Caroline snapped. We leave Friday at dawn. Pack accordingly. The meeting ended, her sisters dispersing like smoke. Violet remained in the drawing room, her mind racing. She could refuse, face her father's disappointment and anger. She could run, leave the estate entirely with nothing but the clothes on her back. Or she could go, walk willingly into whatever they had planned. None of the options ended well. That night, Violet searched her room thoroughly. She found the water pitcher by her bedside had a peculiar residue at the bottom. The tea Caroline had brought that afternoon sat cold on her desk, a thin film on its surface. Even the handkerchief Josephine had lent her smelled wrong, chemical and sharp. They were testing her, seeing how vigilant she'd become, how paranoid, preparing for the final move. Friday arrived like an execution date. Violet packed a small bag with trembling hands. She tucked a letter inside her dress, addressed to her father, explaining everything. If something happened to her, at least there would be evidence. The carriage waited in the drive, dark and enclosed like a hearse. Her sisters were already inside, dressed in traveling clothes, their faces masks of false cheerfulness. Augustus stood beside the carriage, beaming. Have a wonderful time, my dears, he said, kissing each of them in turn. When he reached Violet, he held her a moment longer. This will be good for you. You'll see. Violet climbed into the carriage, taking the seat facing backward. Her sisters arranged themselves around her, Margaret and Beatrice on one side, Caroline and Josephine on the other. The door closed with a decisive click. As the carriage rolled down the drive, Violet watched her father through the window, waving goodbye. The distance grew between them, and with it, her last hope of rescue. She was alone now, trapped with 4 women who wanted her gone. The cottage waited 3 hours away. 3 hours to prepare. 3 hours to accept that she might not survive what came next. The cottage appeared through the mist like something from a nightmare. Small, stone, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. Waves crashed against rocks far below, their rhythm constant and merciless. The isolation was absolute. No neighboring houses, no passing travelers, nothing but gray sky and grayer sea. Mother loved it here, Margaret said, as they climbed from the carriage. She said the sound of the ocean cleared her mind. Violet stood on the gravel path, her bag clutched to her chest. The cottage had a single floor, perhaps 4 rooms total. Behind it, the cliff edge waited, unmarked by fence or warning. One misstep, and there would be nothing but air, then rocks, then water. It's beautiful, Josephine murmured, but she was looking at Violet, not the cottage. They entered through a wooden door that groaned on rusted hinges. Inside smelled of salt and neglect. Dust covered every surface. The furniture sat beneath white sheets like corpses awaiting identification. Margaret pulled the sheets away, revealing worn sofas, a dining table scarred with age, chairs with fraying cushions. We'll need to air it out, Beatrice announced, moving through the rooms with purpose. Caroline, help me with the windows. Josephine, check the kitchen for supplies. Violet, you can rest. You look exhausted." It was true. The 3-hour journey had drained her, constant vigilance taking its toll. But rest meant vulnerability. Rest meant letting down her guard. "I'd rather help." "Nonsense," Margaret said firmly. "You're our guest of honor. Take the room at the back. The view is magnificent." The room at the back. Violet's stomach knotted. The room closest to the cliff. She had no choice but to comply. The room was small, containing only a bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out over the ocean. Beautiful and terrible in equal measure. She tested the door. No lock. Of course not. Violet unpacked her meager belongings, then sat on the bed, listening to her sisters moving through the cottage. They spoke in normal tones, discussing dinner preparations, reminiscing about childhood visits. To anyone listening, they sounded like loving siblings on a peaceful retreat. But Violet heard what lay beneath the words, the pauses that lasted too long, the footsteps that stopped outside her door, the whispered conversations that ceased when she emerged. Dinner was soup and bread, prepared by Margaret with ingredients they'd brought from home. Violet watched as Margaret ladled soup into 5 bowls, trying to track which bowl was meant for her. But Margaret was clever, stirring and rearranging until Violet lost track. "Here," Margaret said, placing a bowl before her. "Eat. You need your strength." Violet stared at the soup. It looked normal, smelled normal, but so had the champagne. "Not hungry," she said. "You haven't eaten all day," Beatrice observed. "Surely you're famished." "I have a headache. I think I'll just go to bed." Caroline laughed, sharp and bitter. "Of course you will. Can't even make it through one meal with us." "Caroline," Margaret said warningly, but her eyes gleamed with something that might have been satisfaction. "Let her rest. We have all weekend." Violet retreated to her room, closing the door and pushing the small dresser against it. Not much of a barricade, but better than nothing. She lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ocean and the murmur of her sisters' voices in the next room. Hours passed. The voices fell silent. Footsteps moved through the cottage, doors opening and closing. Then, finally, stillness. Violet waited, counting her heartbeats, trying to gauge whether they'd truly gone to sleep or were simply waiting for her to let down her guard. The letter to her father pressed against her ribs, a paper shield that would only matter if someone found her body. Exhaustion pulled at her despite her fear. Her eyelids grew heavy. The sound of the waves became hypnotic, rhythmic, soothing. She jolted awake to the sound of her door opening. The dresser scraped across the floor, pushed aside with ease. 4 silhouettes filled the doorway, backlit by moonlight from the main room. For a moment, they simply stood there, and Violet wondered if she was dreaming. Then Margaret spoke. "It's time, Violet." She tried to scream, but Josephine was already at her side, pressing something cloth over her face. The smell was overwhelming, chemical, sickly sweet. Violet thrashed, but her limbs felt strange, disconnected. The room tilted, spun. "Don't fight it," Beatrice said from somewhere far away. "It will only make it worse." Darkness swallowed her whole. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Cold. Movement. The sound of the ocean much louder now. Violet's head lolled, her body refusing to respond to her commands. She was being carried, multiple hands gripping her arms and legs. "Careful," Margaret's voice. "Don't drop her yet." "She's heavier than she looks," Caroline complained. "Almost there." Violet forced her eyes open. Stars overhead, impossibly bright. The roar of waves below. They were outside, moving toward the cliff edge. "Wait," Josephine said, and they stopped. "What if someone finds her, and there are no marks? No explanation?" "We have the note," Margaret replied. "But her father will question it. He'll want proof she was distraught." "What are you suggesting?" Beatrice asked. "We need to rough her up a bit, make it look like she was struggling with herself. Scratches, bruises, signs of distress." Horror flooded through Violet, burning away some of the drug's effects. They were going to hurt her first, stage it properly. She tried to move, to speak, but her body remained useless. "Fine," Margaret said, "but quickly. We need to be done before dawn." They set her down on the rocky ground near the cliff edge. Violet's vision swam, but she could see them now, all four sisters standing over her. Margaret held a piece of torn fabric. Caroline had stones in her hands. Beatrice was adjusting something in the dirt, arranging it just so. "This is for Mother," Margaret said, and there was genuine grief in her voice. "You took her from us. You stole Father's love. You ruined everything." "She was never one of us," Caroline added, her voice breaking. "Always the precious one, the special one. We gave you chances," Beatrice said calmly. "The tea at the ball could have just made you ill, sent you home in disgrace. But you kept surviving, kept being vigilant. You made this necessary." Josephine knelt beside Violet, and for a moment something that might have been regret crossed her face. "I'm sorry it came to this, but you have to understand. There isn't enough love in that house for all of us. Father made his choice. Now we've made ours." Margaret pulled out a piece of paper. The forged suicide note, Violet realized, written in handwriting that mimicked her own. "I cannot bear the weight of Father's expectations," Margaret read aloud. "The pressure of being perfect, of replacing Mother in his eyes. Forgive me, but the sea calls, and I must answer." Quite poetic, don't you think? They were really going to do it. Violet's mind screamed at her body to move, to fight, to do anything. Her fingers twitched. Not much, but something. "Help me with her dress," Margaret instructed Caroline. "It needs to look torn, desperate." As they bent over her, Violet felt sensation returning to her limbs in agonizing increments. The drug was wearing off, but too slowly. They pulled at her dress, creating tears in the fabric. Caroline pressed stones against Violet's arms, creating marks that would look like self-inflicted wounds. "The cliff is steeper here," Beatrice called from the edge. "A fall from this point would be instant." Instant. The word echoed in Violet's mind. They thought one push would send her to the rocks below, that she'd die on impact. They were being merciful in their twisted way. Quick, rather than prolonged. Margaret and Caroline lifted her again, carrying her toward the edge. Violet could feel the wind now, stronger here, whipping her torn dress. The ocean roared its hunger. "Wait," Beatrice said suddenly. "Her shoes. Suicide victims often remove their shoes." They set Violet down again, mere feet from the cliff edge. Josephine knelt and untied Violet's boots, pulling them off with gentle care that felt obscene, given the circumstances. As she did, Violet managed to curl her fingers, then her toes. Control was returning. "There," Josephine said, setting the boots neatly aside. "Now it's perfect." "Everyone grab hold," Margaret commanded. "On 3, we push her over. 1, 2. Violet's hand shot out, grabbing Caroline's ankle. The movement was weak, uncoordinated, but unexpected. Caroline shrieked, stumbling backward. Margaret lost her grip. Violet rolled, instinct overriding thought, trying to get away from the edge. But she rolled the wrong direction. The ground disappeared beneath her. For one terrible moment, she was airborne, the stars and sea trading places. Then impact, brutal and complete. Her shoulder hit stone, her ribs, her leg. Pain exploded through her body as she tumbled downward. She stopped moving, not at the bottom, but on something. A ledge, narrow and cruel. Violet lay gasping, every breath agony. She couldn't move her left leg. Something was broken, maybe several somethings. Above, she heard her sister's voices, muffled by distance and wind. "Did you see where she landed?" That was Beatrice. "Too dark to tell." Margaret sounded uncertain. "Should we go check?" Caroline, nervous now. "And risk being seen climbing down there?" Margaret snapped. "No. It's a 40-foot drop onto rocks. No one survives that. Even if she caught a ledge, she'll die of exposure before morning." "What about the body?" Josephine asked. "The tide comes in at dawn. It will take her out to sea. By the time anyone searches, there will be nothing to find. Just the note, the torn dress at the cliff edge, and the tragic story of a girl who couldn't bear the pressure. And father will be devastated, heartbroken. And we'll be there to comfort him. The loving daughters who tried so hard to save their troubled sister." Footsteps retreated. Their voices faded. Violet lay on the ledge, breathing through pain that threatened to steal her consciousness. Her left leg was definitely broken, twisted at an angle that made her stomach heave. Her ribs felt like knives with each breath. Blood trickled down her face from somewhere. She was 15 feet below the cliff edge, on a ledge barely 3 feet wide. Below, waves crashed against rocks that gleamed like teeth in the moonlight. They were right about one thing. The tide was coming in. She could see it, creeping closer with each wave. Violet tried to move and screamed, the sound lost in the wind and waves. Her body wouldn't cooperate. She was broken, bleeding, alone. The letter to her father was gone, torn away during the fall. No one knew where she was. Her sisters thought her dead. By dawn, the tide would reach this ledge, and their assumption would become reality. She'd survived the fall, but survival wasn't the same as rescue. Above, the sky began to lighten, stars fading into pre-dawn gray. Violet closed her eyes, pain and cold and despair wrapping around her like a shroud. She'd fought so hard, been so vigilant, and it hadn't mattered. Her sisters had won. The last thing she heard before unconsciousness claimed her was the sound of the cottage door closing, and in the distance, a carriage pulling away. They were leaving early, returning to the estate to play their roles as grieving sisters. By the time anyone came looking, this place would be empty, evidence arranged, story prepared. Violet had disappeared, exactly as they'd planned. And the ocean waited below, patient and hungry, ready to erase her completely. Pain was the first thing that returned, not the dull ache of healing, but the sharp, insistent agony of a body pushed beyond its limits. Violet's consciousness surfaced slowly, reluctantly, dragging her back into a reality she'd hoped to escape. She was no longer on the ledge. The realization came gradually, filtered through layers of confusion. Soft fabric beneath her instead of stone. Warmth instead of the biting ocean wind. The smell of herbs and lamp oil rather than salt and blood. Violet forced her eyes open. A ceiling, low and beamed with dark wood. Walls covered in faded wallpaper. A window showing gray afternoon light. This wasn't the cottage. This wasn't the cliff. This wasn't death. You're awake. The voice was female, older, gentle. Don't try to move, dear. You're safe now. A woman appeared in Violet's line of sight, 60 or so, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. She pressed a cool cloth to Violet's forehead. "Where?" Violet's voice came out as barely a whisper, her throat raw. "My cottage, about 2 miles from where Thomas found you. I'm Mrs. Hadley. You've been unconscious for 3 days." 3 days. The words didn't make sense. Violet tried to sit up and gasped as pain lanced through her ribs. "Easy now," Mrs. Hadley cautioned. "Your leg is broken in 2 places. 3 ribs cracked. You had a fever from the cold and exposure. It's a miracle you're alive at all." Memories flooded back. The cliff, the fall, the ledge, her sister's voices above, condemning her to death. "How?" Violet managed. "Thomas Garrett, the fisherman. He checks his pots every morning before dawn. Saw something on the ledge, thought it might be a seal at first. When he realized it was a person," Mrs. Hadley shook her head, "he climbed down to you. Dangerous work, that. The tide was already coming in. Another hour and you'd have been swept away." Violet closed her eyes, tears leaking from the corners. A fisherman she'd never met had risked his life to save hers, while her own sisters had left her to die. "Your family," Mrs. Hadley continued. "Do they know where you are? Thomas wanted to send word, but you had no identification, and you've been too ill to speak until now." "No." The word came out fierce, desperate. "Don't tell them, please." Mrs. Hadley's expression shifted, understanding dawning. "I see. This wasn't an accident, was it?" Violet shook her head, and the movement made her dizzy. "Then you'll stay here until you're strong enough to decide what comes next. No one will know. You have my word." The days that followed blurred together in a haze of pain and healing. Mrs. Hadley tended to Violet with the efficiency of someone who'd nursed many injuries over the years. Thomas the fisherman visited occasionally, a weathered man of few words, who simply nodded when Violet thanked him for saving her life. "Couldn't leave you there," he said gruffly. "Wouldn't be able to sleep knowing I'd passed by." As Violet's strength returned, so did her clarity. She told Mrs. Hadley everything. The favoritism, the poisoned champagne, the cottage, the cliff, the forged suicide note, her sister's cold calculation as they planned her death. Mrs. Hadley listened without judgment, her face growing grimmer with each revelation. "And your father?" she asked when Violet finished. "Does he know what his daughters are capable of?" "He wouldn't believe me if I told him. He never has." "Then you'll need proof." "I have nothing. They took everything. The letter I wrote him was lost in the fall." Mrs. Hadley was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Write another one. But this time, write down everything that happened. Every detail. Dates, times, witnesses. The young lord who saw the tainted champagne. The evidence they left at the cottage. Your injuries, which a doctor can document. Build a case so complete that even your father cannot deny it. And then what? Present it to him? He'll say I'm mad, that I'm making it up." "No," Mrs. Hadley said firmly. "You wait. You heal. You watch. And when the time is right, you return from the dead and expose them for what they are." The plan took shape over the following weeks. Thomas made discreet inquiries in the village, near the Ashford estate, gathering information. The story was as Violet had expected. Her 4 sisters had returned home in tears, bearing the tragic news of Violet's suicide. Augustus was devastated. A memorial service had been held. The estate was in mourning. "They're playing their parts perfectly," Thomas reported. "Grieving sisters, devastated by their loss. Your father has apparently aged 10 years in 2 weeks. The guilt of that twisted in Violet's chest. Her father's grief was real, even if it was based on a lie. But she pushed the guilt aside. She hadn't chosen this. Her sisters had. By the end of the 2nd month, Violet could walk with a cane. Her ribs had healed, though they still ached in cold weather. Her face had lost the pallor of near death, though new scars marked where rocks had cut her during the fall. "You look different," Mrs. Hadley observed one morning. "Harder. Older." "I feel different," Violet admitted. "I died on that cliff. What came back is someone else." She spent her days writing, page after page, documenting everything. The inheritance announcement that had triggered it all. The overheard conversation about making a choice. Every small cruelty leading up to the ball. The tainted champagne, witnessed by Lord Pemberton's son. The sabotaged dress. The forced trip to the cottage. The drugged sleep. The staging. The cold calculation as they threw her off the cliff. Mrs. Hadley read it over when Violet finished. "This is damning," she said quietly. "But you need physical evidence, too." "The cottage," Violet said. "They would have left the forged note there, and possibly other things. They thought I was dead. They wouldn't have been careful about cleaning up." Thomas returned to the cottage under the guise of checking for storm damage. He found it exactly as the sisters had left it. Door unlocked. The fake suicide note tucked between stones at the cliff edge. Violet's boots still sitting neatly nearby. He collected it all, careful not to disturb anything else. When Violet saw the note, written in handwriting that mimicked her own, rage burned through her. The words were perfect, precisely calculated to paint her as fragile and overwrought. Even her father would believe she'd written it. "When?" Violet asked Mrs. Hadley one evening in early autumn. "When do I go back?" "When you're ready. When you're strong enough to face them, and everything that comes after." Violet looked down at her hands, scarred now with marks that would never fade. "I'm ready." The plan was simple. Thomas would drive her to the estate in his cart, approaching at a time when the family would be gathered for dinner. No warning. No announcement. Just Violet, returned from the dead, walking through the door. "Are you certain about this?" Mrs. Hadley asked the night before. "Once you do this, there's no going back. Your family will be destroyed." "They destroyed themselves," Violet replied. "I'm just going to make sure everyone knows it." The next evening, as the sun set over the Devonshire countryside, Thomas's cart rolled up the drive to the Ashford estate. Violet climbed down, leaning on her cane, her heart hammering against her ribs. The house looked exactly the same. Grand, imposing, indifferent. But Violet was different now. She wasn't the naive girl who'd left here 3 months ago. She was someone who'd survived her own sister's murder attempt. Someone who'd stared death in the face and refused to blink. She didn't knock. The door was unlocked, as it always was before dinner. Violet walked through the entrance hall, her cane clicking against marble, following the sound of voices to the dining room. She paused at the doorway, taking in the scene. Her father at the head of the table, looking older, grayer, diminished. Margaret and Beatrice on one side, Caroline and Josephine on the other. 5 place settings instead of 6. They were discussing the sale of some property, their voices subdued, but not grief-stricken. Life had gone on. They'd mourned, performed their roles, and now they were moving forward with the inheritance they'd killed for. Violet stepped into the doorway. Augustus saw her first. His fork clattered to his plate, his face going white as a sheet. "Violet?" 4 heads whipped around. For one perfect moment, Violet watched as the color drained from her sisters' faces. Margaret's mouth opened, closed, opened again with no sound emerging. Caroline made a noise like a wounded animal. Beatrice gripped the table so hard her knuckles went white. Josephine simply stared, her quiet eyes wide with something that might have been horror or disbelief. "Hello, Father," Violet said calmly. "Sisters, I hope I'm not interrupting dinner." Augustus stood so quickly, his chair fell backward. "Violet, my God, Violet, you're alive. Where have you been? We thought... The note, the cliff?" "Yes," Violet said, moving into the room with deliberate care. "You were meant to think that. That was the plan, wasn't it, Margaret?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Margaret said, but her voice shook. "Don't you?" Violet reached into her bag and pulled out the forged suicide note, holding it up. "This is quite convincing. I cannot bear the weight of Father's expectations. Well written. Did you practice my handwriting, or did it come naturally? Violet, what is this?" Augustus looked between his daughters, confusion and dawning horror mixing on his face. "I don't understand." "Let me explain." Violet set the note on the table. Then she withdrew the detailed account she'd written, page after page of documented evidence. "It started the night you announced my inheritance. Do you remember, Father? How you told them I'd receive the London house, the railway shares, everything they'd been denied. That's when you decided I needed to disappear," Violet continued, looking at each sister in turn. "You poisoned my champagne at the ball. Lord Pemberton's son saw the residue. You sabotaged my dress, hoping I'd be humiliated. And when those subtle attempts failed, you brought me to the cottage and threw me off a cliff." "This is insane," Caroline said. But she couldn't meet Violet's eyes. "Is it? Then explain how I ended up on a ledge 15 feet below the cliff edge with a broken leg, cracked ribs, and injuries consistent with being drugged and pushed. Explain the forged note. Explain why Thomas Garrett, the local fisherman, found me unconscious and barely alive at dawn. Explain why you left my boots at the cliff edge, staged just so." Augustus sank into his chair, his face the color of old paper. No, this can't be true." "I'm afraid it is, Father." Violet placed the boots on the table next to the note. "Everything is documented. My injuries were examined by Dr. Harrison in the village. He'll testify. Thomas will testify. Mrs. Hadley, who nursed me back to health, will testify. I have witnesses, evidence, and a written account of everything that happened." "You have nothing," Beatrice said, but her calculated composure was cracking. "It's your word against ours. 4 sisters against 1. Who do you think people will believe? They'll believe the evidence, and they'll believe this." Violet withdrew one final item from her bag, a small vial containing the residue Thomas had carefully collected from the cottage's kitchen. "The drug you used to knock me unconscious, still in the teacup where you left it. I'm sure the authorities will be very interested in analyzing it." Margaret stood abruptly. "Father, she's clearly unstable. The fall must have damaged her mind. She's making up stories, trying to turn you against us." "Am I?" Violet asked quietly. "Then explain why you told the housekeeper you'd be gone 4 days, but you returned after 2. Explain why you left the cottage in such a hurry. Explain why none of you seem surprised that I'm alive, only horrified that I survived." The silence that followed was deafening. Augustus looked at his 4 eldest daughters, really looked at them, perhaps for the first time in years, and whatever he saw there made him close his eyes in pain. My God, he whispered. What have you done? What we had to, Margaret said, and there was no remorse in her voice, only cold justification. You gave her everything. You loved her more than all of us combined. She killed Mother, and you rewarded her for it. She was a baby, Augustus said, his voice breaking. Elizabeth died in childbirth. That wasn't Violet's fault. It felt like her fault, Caroline said bitterly. Every time you looked at her with love, every time you gave her gifts and attention while we stood in the shadows, it felt like she'd stolen everything from us. So you tried to kill her? Augustus stood, and for the first time, Violet saw real fury in her father's face. You drugged your own sister, staged her suicide, and threw her off a cliff to die. And you would have gotten away with it if a fisherman hadn't risked his life to save her. We gave her chances, Josephine said softly. She could have just accepted her place, been grateful for what she had, but she kept surviving, kept fighting back. And for that, she deserved to die? Augustus's voice rose. What kind of monsters have I raised? The kind you created, Beatrice said coldly. You taught us that love was finite, that there wasn't enough to go around. You showed us, every single day, that Violet mattered more than all of us combined. So yes, we chose, and we'd do it again. The admission hung in the air, stark and unforgivable. Violet watched her father's face crumble, watched him realize what his favoritism had created. But she felt no satisfaction, only a deep, weary sadness. The authorities will be here within the hour, Violet said quietly. I sent word before I arrived. They'll want statements from all of us. The evidence will be examined. There will be a trial. Father, Margaret said, turning to Augustus with desperate eyes. You can stop this. Tell them it's all a misunderstanding. Protect your family. My family? Augustus looked at her like a stranger. You stopped being my family the moment you decided murder was preferable to sharing my love. No, I won't protect you. I'll testify against you myself. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel interrupted whatever Margaret might have said next. Through the window, Violet could see 2 constables approaching the house, accompanied by Lord Pemberton and his son. They're here, Violet said. You have a choice now. You can confess, tell the truth, and perhaps receive some mercy. Or you can fight, lie, and force a trial that will drag this family through the mud. Her sisters exchanged glances. Caroline was crying, silent tears streaking her face. Josephine looked down at her hands. Beatrice's jaw was set, defiant. And Margaret, eldest and most calculating, simply closed her eyes. We confess, Margaret said finally. We planned it. We executed it. We failed. The constables entered, and Violet told them everything. Her sisters stood silent as she spoke, their faces masks of varying emotions. When she finished, the constables placed them under arrest. One by one, they were led from the dining room, from the house that had been their gilded cage. Augustus watched them go, then turned to Violet. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice broke on the words. This is my fault. I did this. I created this situation with my favoritism, my blindness. Yes, Violet said simply. You did. Can you ever forgive me? Violet looked at the man who'd loved her too much and her sisters too little. The man whose grief over losing his wife had poisoned everything he touched. I don't know, she said honestly, but I survived, and that's going to have to be enough for now. The trial came and went. Her sisters were convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The scandal destroyed the Ashford name, just as Violet had known it would. But she discovered she didn't care about the name, about the inheritance, about any of it. She sold the London house and most of the railway shares. She kept the estate, but transformed it, opening it as a refuge for women fleeing dangerous situations. Mrs. Hadley became the administrator. Thomas Garrett was hired to maintain the grounds. Augustus lived another 5 years, spending them in quiet penance, funding charitable works, and trying to make amends for the family he'd destroyed. When he died, he left everything to Violet, with a letter begging her forgiveness. She forgave him eventually, though it took time. Not because he deserved it, but because holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Years later, Violet would stand at the cliff edge where she'd almost died and look out over the ocean. The ledge was still there, barely visible from above. She'd insisted it remain unmarked, a reminder that survival often comes down to inches, to chance, to a fisherman who could have looked away, but didn't. She'd disappeared that night, exactly as her sisters had planned. But what returned was stronger, harder, more alive than what had fallen. They'd tried to erase her, and instead, they'd forged her into something unbreakable. And in the end, that was the greatest revenge of all. If Violet's story of survival against all odds moved you, don't let this video be left and forgotten like she almost disappeared off that cliff. Hit that like button to help others find these unwildest stories of resilience and justice. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we're building a community that refuses to let the truth stay buried. Just like Violet transformed tragedy into purpose, you can transform this channel by sharing it with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, even when your own family becomes the enemy. Your support keeps these stories alive.